Hi everyone, I'm Harsha from Foundation for Democratic Reforms, and today we have with us Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan, and we are going to talk about the Speaker of the Lok Sabha and in general what can we say about the functioning of our Parliament. Welcome, sir.
Good afternoon, Harsha.
Sir, so for the fourth time in independent India and only the first time since 1976, the Speaker of the Lok Sabha is going to be determined by an election. How are we here?
No, it doesn't matter. After all, the rules provide for an election if there is a contest. The issue is deeper than whether the speaker is by election or by unanimous consent, Harsha. British Parliament in many ways is the mother parliament for us. No, we learned from them. We borrowed their practices. Our constitutional model is British essentially, Westminster model, etc. But unfortunately, insofar as the speaker is concerned, and many other practices, we don't follow the British model. Only to the extent that the party with the majority support in the legislature forms the government, and the Council of Ministers is appointed by the President on the advice of the Prime Minister. Only to that extent we are following the Constitution, that there is an election, members are elected, the majority forms the government, and the Prime Minister is the head of the government, etc. Otherwise, the many important practices in a parliamentary democracy that are necessary for the health of the system, they're not being followed in India. That is the real problem. It doesn't matter if there's an election or not. I'll give you two examples just to give an idea of what I'm speaking about. The present Speaker of the British Parliament, House of Commons, is Lindsay Hoyle. He was elected as Speaker in 2019. Conservatives have been in power in Britain for the past 14 years, 2010 onwards, when David Cameron became the Prime Minister. You know which party the present Speaker belongs to?
If I had to guess, the ruling party?
He is a Labour Party member. While Conservatives have a clear majority, a Labour Party member became the Speaker. His predecessor, John Bercow, was the Speaker for about 10 years, from 2009 to 2019. He was elected as Speaker while Labour Party was in power. Do you know to which party John Bercow belongs?
Labour Party.
Conservative Party. See, the custom, in most cases, occasionally there might have been breaches, is if a party is in power, then they will allow the other party member to become the Speaker. On both sides, there is total integrity. The government side has no desire to control the parliament through the office of the Speaker. And the Speaker has no desire to undermine the government for partisan political advantage. It works both ways. It's not enough to have only one side. If the Speaker is given the power from the opposition, then he suddenly declares that the party in government doesn't have a majority. It happened in this country. Governors did it, sometimes speakers did it. For instance, there was a notorious incident in 1998 in Uttar Pradesh when the then governor, Ramesh Bhandari, he suddenly dismissed the Kalyan Singh government when they had a clear majority and installed Jagadambika Pal as Chief Minister without any support, with a very small support. And the Speaker manufactured a House vote and said a minority group actually had a majority. The Supreme Court had to intervene. Within 24 hours, when there was a very transparent voting, that government was dismissed. So it's both sides. You require very high level of conduct. We have to adapt the British practices. Now we are so far from that tradition that if you are in power, a member from the opposition would be the Speaker. It's something unthinkable in India. And if indeed some such gesture is made by a ruling party in a state or at the national level, chances are that that will be used as a weakness to undermine the government illegitimately and in a very partisan manner. So we have to rise above this pettiness now in the country. And slowly, you may not be able to establish the practice of British Parliament of having an opposition member as a Speaker, but there are many other practices that are necessary. And we have to really improve the conduct of the House. And the office of the Speaker, in that sense, is a very important institution.
Right. So one of the questions that I had when I was looking into this topic was while we may not necessarily have the space for that kind of trust between the ruling government and the opposition, which, as you point out, the UK Parliament enjoys, and which I'm sure leads to a lot of positive consequences for the functioning of the Parliament, we have the opportunity to demonstrate this trust in the form of the role of the Deputy Speaker. So conventionally, what has happened in our country is that the ruling party decides on the speaker, and the deputy speaker position is given to the two members from the opposition party to.
Not always, not always, but yes, there has been an unspoken custom for some time, but it's not always implemented, particularly in states. I remember vividly in Andhra Pradesh Assembly when I was a member in 2009. I advised the Chief Minister to have an opposition deputy speaker because there's no significant concession. The speaker is in command anyway, and in any important vote, certainly the speaker will preside. There's no chance of a deputy speaker undermining the government on a partisan consideration. But that concession will go a long way to build some kind of a harmony in the House and make it easier to build consensus on important issues. The then Chief Minister was willing to consider, Dr. Rajshekhar Reddy. Then he explained to me his problem, internal party problem. The Speaker was already decided, elected. The Deputy Speaker, the Congress party, which was in power at the time in the state, they wanted to reward somebody from a faction which is not with the Chief Minister. Within the party, there are factions. No, it happens. Now, his worry was if he then accepted my proposal, then the party high command would think that it's a deliberate ploy to deny the rival faction in the party space. He explained to me that and said, please forgive me, I cannot take this forward for this reason. So, ideally, I think it's better to have the Deputy Speaker or some other concession like that. The opposition also is given space. But more important in the conduct of the House, the speakers must function absolutely above parties. Again, to go back to House of Commons, once you are a speaker, you resign from any political party and forever, not temporarily. A speaker never goes back to government, never goes back to a political party. A speaker is speaker as long as he or she continues to be in elective politics. A speaker is not dethroned. The speaker continues. That's why, if you notice, 2009 to 2019, Berko continued as speaker. Similarly, many other speakers, they lost the next term, next government, etc. And the speaker, when obviously has to be, if he has to be a member for the next term, he has to contest elections. Speaker always contests as an independent. And the major parties do not put up a candidate against the speaker.
As a sign of respect for the position?
Also for unanimity.
Right.
Once he is above parties, once he is the Speaker of the House, and if he is continuing as Speaker, that's it. He is not part of the partisan politics. This is a very high standard of conduct. It's good for all the parties across the spectrum. So it's not merely about a small gesture of one political party in power at a point of time. It's also changing the very culture of the Parliament. And unless that is done, a few symptomatic things, symbolic things will not really change the nature of Parliament. For instance, if a member of the opposition or members of the ruling party, if a member of a party is not able to vote for reasons beyond his control, if it's a deliberate abstaining, that's a different thing. That's a conscious choice. But you're hospitalized, you're injured, therefore you're not able to vote. You know what typically happens in British Parliament? The other party, equal number of members will abstain from voting. Because the idea of Parliament is not, a numbers game, somehow manufacturing a majority on a given vote. It is a very gentlemanly kind of an exercise, a very noble exercise. So if two members are hospitalized, very sick, cannot come to the Parliament, there's a very critical vote, then two members at the other side voluntarily abstain from voting. That is the level of consciousness. That's the level of dignity and majesty of the representative democracy. I think we are very far removed from that reality. The first Speaker of the House, G.V. Maulankar, he made an attempt because they were all influenced, the first generation parliamentarians of India, they were all schooled in the British politics. They actually lived and studied in Britain, understood the way the system worked. They tried to adapt those practices. But slowly the decline became precipitous. In every respect, it's not merely the Speaker. If an MP or an MLA, let alone MP, an MLA in many states, you have to spend 50 or 60 crores to be elected. Politics has become now a life or death struggle. And therefore, we have to think deeper instead of merely blaming each other. How do we restore the trust and mutual respect? How do we give voice to even an individual member, let alone a party or a minority or the opposition, but even an individual member? How do you build practices? The rules are there. There's no problem with the rules. Our rules are more or less a replica of the rules in British Parliament. But just because you have rules in the rule book doesn't mean that the Parliament functions well or Assembly functions well. Because the party leaders across the spectrum, those in power and those in opposition, they're all equally guilty. They don't have an interest in having reasoned debate in Parliament. They want to only show machana. The ruling party wants to control, the opposition wants to obstruct. Ultimately, the loss is that of the electorate, the voters, and the country. So it's a much deeper problem than merely an individual speaker. But it's symptomatic. The way the speaker is treated, the way the speaker functions, is symptomatic of what is wrong with our political process.
That's a very insightful take on the issue. And so one other question that this topic brings us to is the power of the speaker in the Lok Sabha. So my question is, what are your thoughts on the Lok Sabha speaker enjoys powers such as categorizing a bill as the money bill, as well as having a final say on matters related to defection. So what are your thoughts on the power of this speaker as it stands today?
See, the speaker's institution came about from 1707 in Britain, after the Glorious Revolution and then the unification of Scotland and Britain. Then Parliament in the current form began functioning in around 1707. In these 317 years, they realized that if Speaker is not trusted by the whole House, Speaker is the custodian of the House. Speaker represents the whole House. If the power of the Speaker is not individual power, it is the power of the House. So Speaker enjoys powers only as long as the House entrusts him that power. For instance, a Speaker, on behalf of the House, can actually expel a member or can suspend the member. But it works only as long as the House is willing to go along with that. That means, in the Indian context, the House has no independence. It's the leaders of the parliamentary party or legislative party. So ultimately, it's the 6 or 7 or 5 or 4 or 8 party leaders that matter. Typically in India, while Speaker on paper is given a lot of powers because the implied consent of the House is always there, Speaker speaks on behalf of the House. In reality, our party leaders are unwilling to give that power to the Speaker, both in power and in opposition. Even though those in power complain about the mischief in Parliament and the anarchy in Parliament, etc., unruly behavior and protests in Parliament, they really don't want to curb it beyond a point because they also behave exactly the same way when they're in opposition. So that became the standard template in the country. And the people in the media also, supposing a member or a group of members, they really make very valid points in Parliament and come out with rich debate, that's hardly taken note of in the country. The moment one member misbehaves, talks out of turn, or in a very rude manner, or goes into the well of the House, obstructs the Parliament, that becomes the headline news. Whenever the leaders of the parties, they allow debate, our Parliament behaved superbly. I remember 2 instances, for instance. The Lokpal bill. It was an excellent debate. In the House, in both houses, there was an excellent debate, a very high quality. Because for once the leaders of the political parties in power and opposition decided, we will genuinely debate the issue. Similarly, GST, when the constitutional amendment for GST introduction was brought in before Parliament, again there was an excellent debate. No, if Parliament is capable of debating these very complex issues in a very rich and very detailed manner, insightful manner, obviously they can debate many other issues equally well. So it's not so much the Parliament is incapable or Speaker is unwilling. It is the party leaders who don't want the Parliament or the assemblies to function in a sensible manner. I'm making this very serious allegation with great sense of responsibility. So it's bigger than some symbolism. We have to wake up. The parties must realize ultimately it's about governing the country, having reasoned public debate, and persuading each other. If Parliament functions as a lawyer jirga, no matter what is the issue, no matter what is the stand, the parties in power say one thing, party in opposition always opposes, irrespective of merits. And members have no other choice but to raise their hands according to the party diktat. Many people think it's a good thing. No, it's a terrible thing. We kill the Parliament. We kill the assemblies. If the members of the House, elected by the people, the representatives of the people, have no freedom to speak as they believe genuinely, if they have to take a diktat of the party, then Parliament is already dead. There's a deeper issue here. Somehow in India, we think this anti-defection law must apply to every single debate. If you apply it only to a no confidence motion or to budget, I can understand. Why should you apply to every debate? As a result, what happened? Take the Muslim Women's Bill. It was a terrible retrogressive bill, a very reactionary kind of a bill, illiberal bill, affecting the rights of Muslim women, poor Muslim women. The Prime Minister of the day felt compelled because of the religious orthodoxy. Some people protested and they were afraid of vote banks and all that. Many members of Congress party in Parliament opposed it. They didn't want it. But by the time the anti-defection law was already in place, the 52nd Amendment incorporated in 1985. So members had no choice. The present governor of Kerala, for instance, Arif Muhammad Khan, he had to resign. He resigned as a minister. He was in the Home Ministry at that time. His career was finished in Congress party because of that, because he took a principled stand. So and in the process, what is the loss? The country is the one that lost. That led to a reaction from the other side, the Hindu fundamentalist forces. Indian politics was never the same again. And government tried to overcompensate. Similarly, when a Supreme Court judge was to be impeached, again, the then ruling party, Congress, gave a fear to Congress members not to vote. The impeachment failed. Therefore, the judges became totally unaccountable today in the country. Though notionally they're accountable to Parliament, in reality they're unaccountable. So time and again we have seen, if Parliament or the legislatures act as lawyer jirgas, blindly members merely say yes to whatever the party bosses say, and that's what constitutionally is mandated. And even otherwise, if you oppose the party bosses, your political future is sealed. They will not give you a seat next time. So you cannot separate the functioning of the Speaker and the legislature from the functioning of the political parties. We are somehow thinking these are all isolated issues. No, these are all linked issues.
So you often talk about centralization of power and how that is a big problem that has consequences across the spectrum. In this context, what seems to stand out is if legislators are mandated to vote along party lines, basically you're killing the freedom of the legislator in the parliament. That's what is clear to the eye. But what it also means is that the representatives from the electorate who have chosen these legislators, you are in essence killing their voice in the parliament.
Absolutely. And it's no longer a genuine democracy. It is a particracy, if there is some such thing,
Right. And so towards this, how does India go about rectifying this issue, this complex sounding issue?
I think there are three broad approaches required. The first is we must either repeal the anti-defection provisions or apply them only for a no confidence motion and a budget. Because traditionally, Westminster model, if a budget fails, the government has to resign. If obviously in a no confidence motion or confidence motion, the government loses majority, they have to resign. So these affect the survival of the government. And all other matters, the members must be allowed to free voice. You must not allow the anti-defection law provisions to apply to those conditions. That's the first initial minimal step required to restore freedom. That's not enough. We must bring internal democracy in parties, genuine internal democracy, particularly in respect to the candidature in future elections. Even if there's no constitutional embargo, even if there's no fear of legal disqualification from the House by defying the party whip, the party can always deny the candidature in the next election. Our legislators in the country are completely slaves of the party bosses, even outside the legislature, because they have no ability to reach out to the electorate and get nominated as members. There are no primary elections. There's no democratic process of candidate choice. And there's, of course, no democratic process of leadership choice itself. Generation after generation, individuals and families control as if they are private estates or private companies, feudal fiefdoms. So that must change. The third is in two parts. One part is customs, the traditions, slowly. We can't do it overnight. I think it's too far-fetched to say that an opposition member can be the speaker in the current Indian context. On both sides, there are problems. But slowly but steadily, other practices we must try to imbibe and make them sanctified. Elections, for instance, no matter who is the election commissioner, there are certain practices which have become internalized in the country. That's why many people who argue that no election commissioner appointment, this, that, these are much less important than are believed. No matter who is the election commissioner, there's a system in place and there is public attention. There are traditions and practices which cannot be easily altered. So we must bring certain practices and traditions to the legislative functioning. But the second part is a much bigger one. Unless you go back to politics as a noble endeavor, instead of this no holds barred, life or death struggle for power. 50 crores for a state assembly constituency election. Andhra Pradesh and Telangana and Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, you see what is happening. And in a poor country like India, you spend 50 crores, most of it illegitimately, for distribution of money to the voters. You think these people really care about norms and propriety and democracy? If money is the most important consideration for political advancement, do you think that they care about constitutional propriety and India's national interest? It will be about the personal interest. You can't blame them also. So you have to bring about electoral reform. So graded things. You can't do everything at one go. But at the very least, you can now remove the weight of anti-defection law being applied at the drop of a hat by the party leaders and remove the autocracy of the political parties.
I wanted to discuss systemic reforms, but you already brought up most of what I wanted to discuss. So just in the current context, what I want to talk about is the most recent NDA coalition government, the Vajpayee government. There are instances there where there was genuine space for dissenting legislators, for people who have voices and votes which are against the government. And now we have a trend in the most recent 17th Lok Sabha. We had an unprecedented number of MPs from both the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha that were suspended. So I think the statistics say it's like in excess of 200 MPs were suspended. Are we moving in a positive direction when it comes to functioning?
The answer is self-evident. There's a lot of room for improvement. But again, let me re-emphasize, the fault lies on both sides. It's not a simple case of somebody being bad, somebody being good. It's much more complicated because you require both the hands to applaud. Unless both sides exercise restraint and good sense and dignity, we cannot restore the supremacy of Parliament. Notionally, Parliament is supreme in our system because, after all, that's the only elected body in the country. Parliament or state legislatures. Every other organ of state is a derivative of Parliament, the government, and through the government and Parliament, then various institutions. Everything is through this. This is the only sovereignty of the people. Now, unless we bring back that majesty to the Parliament and state legislatures by a systemic change, the kind of things that we discussed, there's going to be a huge problem. Unfortunately, what's happening is parties have lost the capacity to mobilize the people through rational debate. It's again a much deeper issue than even structural and institutional problems. Therefore, they adopt three tactics. Money. I distribute money, you vote. It doesn't mean that Distribution of money guarantees the vote, but without distributing money, there's no chance of getting the vote. That became more or less the norm in many states of the country. Short-term welfare at the cost of economic future of the country. Let the future be doomed. We don't care about the finances. We don't care whether public purse allows it or not. As the Prime Minister, I think outgoing Prime Minister of Singapore said, there's an auction going on in the country. I'll give this, some other party says I'll give even more. With public money, ignoring the public functions, why the government is appointed, namely to ensure that the collective needs are fulfilled. Ignoring that completely, you treat now voters as mendicants, and there's a transactional thing. I give money to you, I give some other freebie to you, therefore you vote for me. And then polarization on caste, region, religion in a very diverse society. Now, what is happening in that context is it's becoming more and more difficult for political parties to persuade the people on rational grounds. So the easiest thing for the opposition to do is shout from rooftop, go into the well of the house, which is unthinkable. It's not to be done. Go into the well of the house and then disrupt, and your merit or your accomplishment is measured by how much of disruption you caused. That's a disgrace. But there's no need to be very cynical or despairing. There are cases where members could make a significant difference in shaping public attitudes and the attitudes of the legislature by their conduct, impeccable conduct and logical approach to public debates. I was privileged to be in the State Assembly in Andhra Pradesh. I never deviated from a single rule. In fact, the rules say you should not even stand up. You only should raise your hand to attract the eye of the speaker, the presiding officer. Then he'll give you a chance if there's an occasional opportunity. So I strictly adhere to that. Never indulged in any kind of obstructive protest or anything. No walkouts, no well, nothing. And I got, after the Chief Minister and the opposition leader, the highest amount of time, being a lone member of an unrecognized political party. Because the House wanted it. The House wants serious discussion. As long as it's above partisanship, above pettiness. It's not about throwing blame on somebody, which is coming up with constructive solutions. So I believe genuinely our parliamentarians and legislators actually want a better debate with all the imperfections. As long as that is there, I think there is a hope. The second is, you mentioned Vajpayee government. One of the brightest moments of our parliamentary democracy in the past 30, 40 years was in 1999, when Speaker Balayogi, Mr. Balayogi was a member of parliament from Amanapuram constituency. He became the Speaker of the House. No, I don't know if many people remember, Mr. Giridhar Gamang, who was Chief Minister of Orissa, was continuing as Member of Parliament. He was still not elected as a legislator in the state. And the Constitution says within 6 months, you must be elected as a member of the legislature to continue as Chief Minister. And if you are elected as a member of the legislature in the state, then within 15 days, you have to choose one of these two. So it was in this period of 6 months. He was not elected to the state legislature. He was continuous member of parliament, but he was actually the executive branch head of the state. Now, an issue came up whether or not Mr. Giridhar Gamang must be allowed to vote as a chief minister in parliament. His argument is, he was a member of parliament, therefore he shouldn't try to vote. The speaker could have said anything. He was from the Congress party, the opposition. Everybody knew the vote was going to be very close. 1 or 2 votes will decide the fate of the government. I mean, there can't be a higher stake than that in a vote. And the speaker made an amazing and bold decision. He said, as long as a member of parliament, I cannot tell him he cannot vote. But as chief minister, it's not proper. I leave it to the member's conscience. Ultimately, the member voted against the government and government fell by 1 vote. The Prime Minister Vajpayee, there were 2 remarkable things about that. One, he did not attempt to buy a single member of parliament. As we know from the earlier and subsequent conduct in parliament, buying members of parliament in a case like this was not that difficult for a Prime Minister. They could have easily bought 20, 30 MPs. The Prime Minister never did that. And 2, he never created a problem. The Prime Minister did not abuse anybody. He calmly resigned, went back to the people, and people gave him a bigger mandate. In fact, I praised Mr. Balajogi in my columns, and immediately he called me up and said, I'm so grateful to you. I'm very worried because my decision cost the government survival, whether I did the right thing. I said, look, yes, it's unfortunate that the government fell like that, but it's not your fault. You did the honorable thing. You did the right thing. If you curtailed a member's right to vote because he happened to be chief minister, though it's an unusual situation, that probably was not right either. He was a member of parliament elected duly. He should have the right to vote. It's for him to whether continue there and to vote as chief minister or not. He did the right thing. So there is still that spirit. I know we don't have Malonkars easily, but we still have that spirit. So I'm optimistic, and I'm sure a parliament that allowed a very meaningful and recent debate on GST bill or a Lokpal bill, I don't see any good reason why it should not allow a recent debate on farm laws. For instance, farm laws everybody wanted. All parties had them in their agenda for 10, 15 years. But the moment it came up in parliament, because of the culture of parliament's functioning, unfortunately, everybody took a very partisan line. There's no via media, there's no sensible approach. It's all black and white. You say it, I oppose it. I say it, you oppose it. It's not right. It is demeaning themselves. The parliamentarians are demeaning themselves. The parliament is undermining itself. And the country is poorly served.
Right. And speaking on short-term welfare measures, I think you always try to be optimistic, and you see there are enough reasons to be optimistic. Would the decision of the NDA government, previously the BJP government, to not resort to short-term measures before something as crucial as the national elections, which they very well could have done, is that another cause for optimism?
Absolutely. It's an act of great courage. Now, forget parties. Economic management of a country is the most important task of a government. How the public funds, the tax money is utilized. Is it in a public auction to give individual welfare to favored people? Welfare is necessary. There's no question, particularly in a poor country. But if government is all about welfare, disregarding the future, building the future, infrastructure, economic growth, and if government is all about short-term freebies and then driving the country into a debt crisis from which it cannot recover, it's a disaster. The next generation is going to pay a price. If you borrow money and spend it on yourself temporarily without building assets, basically you're borrowing from the future. And any government or any political party that says, I will not borrow from the future recklessly, without building assets, without promoting economic growth and wealth creation, we must give them due respect. And I hope political parties will exercise restraint. Right now, we're in a very dangerous phase where the fiscal prudence that became somewhat relevant in our public discussions after 1991 is now given the go-by increasingly. Many states and at the union level, many parties are becoming utterly reckless, irresponsible, short-sighted in their quest for power at the cost of the future generations.
So, namaste, sir. Thank you. That's all I wanted to discuss.
Thank you, Harsh.